There are moments in life when silence feels safer than speaking out. For years, thousands of employees at one of America's most powerful corporations lived under the shadow of a man who ruled with arrogance, cruelty, and unchecked power. No one dared to contradict him. No one dared to stand up. But one ordinary employee, a cafeteria cook barely noticed in the grand halls of corporate wealth, decided that enough was enough. What began as a single act of defiance inside a crowded dining hall would unravel a billion-dollar empire and expose secrets darker than anyone could imagine. How did someone with no money, no influence, and no authority manage to bring down a man who thought he was untouchable? At the heart of Chicago's financial district, a gleaming skyscraper rose above the city skyline. Inside, behind walls of glass and polished marble, Langston Global Industries operated like a kingdom. It was a world of power suits, million-dollar deals, and a hierarchy so rigid that even the most senior executives spoke in careful whispers. At the very top sat Edward Langston III, a man whose name carried weight far beyond the walls of his company. Billionaire, philanthropist on paper, ruthless tyrant in practice, he had built an empire that stretched across continents. To his board, he was untouchable. To his employees, he was feared. But this story is not about Edward. It begins in the basement level of that same skyscraper, in the cafeteria where employees came and went without a second glance. For most, the cafeteria was simply a place to grab a quick meal before returning to the grind. For Monica Harris, it was her world. Monica was new to the company, a 34-year-old woman who had seen more than her share of life's struggles. To many, she was invisible, just another uniformed worker in a kitchen staff made up largely of people of color. Every morning, she tied her apron, pulled back her hair, and prepared trays of food for executives who rarely bothered to look her in the eye. Yet, beneath the surface, Monica carried a quiet dignity, the kind that cannot be stripped away by circumstance. She was meticulous about her work, respectful to those around her, and determined to keep her head down. After all, a paycheck was a paycheck, and for her family, every dollar mattered. Chicago was not an easy city to survive in, especially for someone without wealth or influence. Monica had grown up in a working-class neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and respect was often harder to earn than money. Still, she found strength in her mother's words, "Your worth is not measured by their titles, baby. Don't let anyone make you forget who you are." It was this inner voice that guided her through long shifts and quiet moments of frustration. Langston Global was a stark contrast to everything Monica had known. Upstairs, in offices lined with mahogany desks and panoramic views of the city, power moved quickly, often crushing those who stood in its way. Downstairs, in the cafeteria, workers operated under constant pressure. Deadlines for meals, strict inspections, and the unspoken rule that mistakes would not be forgiven. The divide was clear, those who ruled and those who served. Monica belonged to the latter group, though she never let it define her spirit. She noticed things others overlooked. How the executives avoided eye contact with the kitchen staff. How jokes at the expense of the help floated through the air, coated in fake laughter. How employees who complained too loudly about working conditions seemed to quietly disappear. There was a culture of silence, one that ran deep and suffocated anyone who dared to challenge it. And then there was Edward Langston himself. Few cafeteria workers ever crossed paths with him, but his reputation preceded him. Stories circulated like whispered warnings. His temper, his cutting remarks, his disdain for anyone he considered beneath him. For some, these were cautionary tales. For Monica, they were reminders of something she already knew too well. The face of arrogance rarely hides for long. Still, she never expected to stand in his path. She was there to work, to provide, to keep her head low and her heart steady. Yet, as the weeks passed, Monica began to sense a storm brewing. Small incidents hinted at what was to come. A manager's nervous glances whenever Edward entered the cafeteria. Whispers among staff about the billionaire's unpredictable visits. The unease was palpable, but no one dared to name it out loud. What Monica could not have known was how quickly her world would collide with his. She had no power, no influence, no allies in high places. But what she did have was something far more dangerous to a man like Edward Langston: the courage to refuse humiliation. In the grand scheme of Langston Global Industries, Monica was just one person in a sea of thousands. To Edward, she was insignificant. But to those who would soon watch the events unfold, she would become something far greater. Because sometimes, history doesn't turn on the shoulders of the powerful. Sometimes, it begins in the quiet corners of a cafeteria, where one voice decides to rise against centuries of silence. And in the coming days, that voice would not only challenge Edward Langston but shake the foundation of everything he had built. Monica's first weeks passed in relative quiet, but the silence was deceptive. She soon realized that beneath the polished surface of Langston Global Industries, a darker current flowed. The tension between executives and cafeteria staff was unspoken but visible. Executives barked orders at their assistants, who in turn snapped at cafeteria workers. Every interaction was a reminder of who held power and who did not. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was during the executive lunch hour, when the dining hall was filled with senior managers and visiting clients. Conversations buzzed with business deals and corporate gossip. Monica and her team moved quickly behind the serving line, making sure every tray was filled, every plate spotless. She was ladling soup when the air shifted. A hush rolled through the room. Edward Langston III had entered. He was larger than life in every sense, not just in stature but in presence. His icy blue eyes scanned the cafeteria like a searchlight, and every employee stiffened. People avoided his gaze, lowering their heads as though looking at him too long would invite disaster. Edward didn't just command attention, he demanded submission. He walked to the buffet table, lifted a plate, and immediately scowled. "Disgraceful," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. He poked at the food with disgust, then raised his voice so that it echoed across the dining hall. "This is what passes for a meal in a company of my stature? Pathetic." Forks froze midair. Conversations stopped. Monica felt the weight of 250 pairs of eyes waiting to see what would happen. Edward wasn't finished. His criticisms grew sharper, crueler, and more personal. He mocked the food, the presentation, and even the staff who prepared it. His words dripped with contempt, but when his gaze landed on Monica, the insult cut deeper. "People like this," he said, his voice cold, "shouldn't be preparing food in a serious company." The cafeteria fell silent. His words carried more than arrogance. They carried venom, laced with a racism everyone heard but no one dared to acknowledge. Monica felt her chest tighten, her throat burn. Yet in that moment, something inside her snapped. Her voice rang out, thunderous and unshakable. "You have no right to talk to me that way." Gasps rippled through the room. Trays clattered against tables. For the first time in years, someone had publicly challenged Edward Langston. The shock was visible on every face. Employees who had once looked at Monica as invisible now stared at her in stunned disbelief. Edward froze, his smirk faltering. For a split second, it seemed he might laugh it off. But then his expression hardened. The predator had been challenged in front of his prey, and humiliation burned deeper than any wound. From that moment on, Monica's life at Langston Global became a battlefield. By Monday morning, her schedule had been rearranged without explanation. She was reassigned to the toughest shift, starting at 4:30 a.m., ending long after exhaustion had set in. Every day, Edward appeared in the cafeteria like a shadow, searching for flaws. If the coffee was too hot, he exploded. If the trays weren't aligned, he made a scene. His remarks became sharper, his tone dripping with subtle racism. Not the kind that could be filed in an HR complaint, but the kind that left no doubt about its intent. The pressure was relentless. Monica began to dread each day, yet she refused to bow. What Edward didn't know was that she wasn't just a cafeteria worker. She had once trained as a chef under an investigative culinary expert, someone who specialized in exposing health violations and labor abuses. Monica knew the signs of corruption, and she began to notice them everywhere. Expired meat repackaged with new labels. Freezers are running at unsafe temperatures. Gas equipment is leaking dangerously close to flames. Cleaning staff, many of them immigrants, forced to use toxic chemicals without protective gear. Every irregularity went into a growing file that she kept hidden in her locker. Quietly, carefully, Monica began building her case. But she wasn't alone for long. One afternoon, a woman approached her at a cafe 6 blocks from the office. Denise Carter, the company's senior internal auditor, had been following a trail of suspicious numbers in cafeteria contracts. What she discovered shocked even her. Nearly $5 million siphoned off over 3 years, pocketed directly by Edward Langston. Denise shared her findings with Monica, and together they realized the scope of what they were facing. Fraud, health code violations, systematic abuse, it was bigger than either of them imagined. Monica added her photographs, her notes, her growing stack of evidence. Denise added spreadsheets, contracts, and financial reports. Piece by piece, the truth came together like a puzzle too damning to ignore. Still, the danger was enormous. If Edward discovered what they were doing, retaliation would be swift and merciless. Monica often lay awake at night, wondering if she had pushed too far, if challenging him in the cafeteria had sealed her fate. Yet she pressed forward. The more Edward tried to crush her, the more determined she became to expose him. The tension grew unbearable. Every time she saw Edward's cold stare sweep across the cafeteria, she knew he was waiting for her to break. Every insult, every manufactured failure, every subtle humiliation was designed to push her into silence. But Monica refused to bend. And as the evidence piled higher, she and Denise realized something chilling. Edward wasn't just cruel. He was untouchable, or at least he believed he was. The question that haunted them both was simple. How do you bring down a man who thinks he can never fall? The day of reckoning arrived in a way no one could have predicted. Edward Langston, the man who prided himself on being untouchable, had just received what he considered the crowning jewel of his career, a nomination for the National Business Leadership Council's Ethical CEO of the Year award. To him, it was proof that his empire wasn't just powerful, it was untarnished. He had bribed committee members, doctored reports, and polished his image until it gleamed. In Edward's mind, the award was already his. But behind the scenes, Monica Harris and Denise Carter had been preparing for this very moment. After months of careful documentation, photos of rotten food, videos of unsafe kitchens, spreadsheets showing millions siphoned into Edward's accounts, they were ready. The most damning evidence came in the form of a hidden recording. 27 minutes of Edward's own voice, dripping with racism, mocking the very employees who had built his empire. 3 hours before the ceremony, Denise walked into the office of Jonathan Reeves, president of the council and a man known for his commitment to transparency. She handed him a thick file, heavy with truth. Reeves listened to the recording, flipped through the spreadsheets, and stared at the photographs. His decision was immediate. That evening, under glittering chandeliers in New York City's Hudson Grand Ballroom, 600 guests gathered. Executives, politicians, reporters, the elite of American business had come to celebrate integrity. Cameras flashed, music played, and Edward Langston stood tall, certain of victory. As his name was announced, he stepped onto the stage, his smile wide, his voice smooth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "it is an honor to be recognized for my commitment to family values and inclusive leadership." The words froze on his tongue. Jonathan Reeves had walked onto the stage, his expression stern. He held up a hand, cutting Edward off mid-sentence. The crowd murmured, confused. Then Reeves spoke into the microphone. "Before we proceed, We have received evidence that one of tonight's nominees is guilty of corporate fraud, health code violations, and systematic racial discrimination. The ballroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, the frantic shuffle of reporters adjusting their cameras. Edward's smile faltered, his color draining. Behind him, the giant screens lit up. First came the photographs. Trays of spoiled meat, leaking gas pipes, kitchen staff handling chemicals with bare hands. Then came the spreadsheets, millions in fake expenses traced back to Edward's personal accounts. And then the recording. People like this shouldn't be preparing food. Certain backgrounds lack the intelligence for corporate standards. The words boomed through the speakers, unmistakably Edward's voice. Silence fell thick and heavy. Every eye in the room turned to him. The cameras zoomed in, capturing his panic, his trembling hands gripping the podium. He tried to recover, to laugh it off. This is a conspiracy. Lies fabricated by people with an agenda. But Reeves didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his voice sharp. Mr. Langston, your company was built on exploitation and deception. The only jobs you've truly created are for your defense attorneys. The audience erupted, not in applause, but in outrage. Reporters shouted questions, flashes lit the stage, and security moved in. Edward was escorted off the podium, his protests drowned out by the roar of the crowd. In a matter of minutes, his carefully crafted empire of lies had crumbled live on national television. For Monica, watching the broadcast from Chicago, the moment felt surreal. The man who had humiliated her, who had tried to crush her spirit with every insult and every act of cruelty, was finally exposed. But it wasn't just about revenge, it was about validation. The truth was undeniable now, and the world had seen it. The fallout was immediate. Within 72 hours, federal prosecutors filed 19 charges against Edward: fraud, tax evasion, labor violations, and discrimination. Langston Global stock collapsed by nearly 70% in a week. Shareholders launched lawsuits. Contracts worth hundreds of millions vanished overnight. Edward's downfall was absolute. His billion-dollar empire was in ruins. His name, once associated with wealth and power, now stood as a symbol of corruption and arrogance. And yet, as satisfying as his collapse seemed, for Monica, the story wasn't finished. Because this wasn't only about one man. It was about the system that allowed him to thrive, the silence of those who looked away, the fear that kept thousands of employees from speaking out. The cameras had caught Edward's humiliation, but what would happen next? Would justice truly be served? Would the company finally change? Or would another man like him rise to take his place? One thing was certain: Monica Harris was no longer invisible. The world had heard her story, even if they didn't yet know her name. And soon, the company that once tried to bury her would have no choice but to face her. Because courage doesn't end when the villain falls. It begins with what comes after. When the dust settled, Edward Langston's empire was nothing more than a hollow shell. The skyscraper that once seemed untouchable became the scene of frantic board meetings, lawsuits, and investigations. The arrogance that had once defined the man was replaced by headlines describing him as a criminal, a fraud, a cautionary tale. But for Monica Harris, the story did not end with Edward's downfall. In fact, it was only the beginning. 3 days after the scandal erupted, Monica received an unexpected summons to the executive boardroom, a place she had never been invited to before. Walking through the polished double doors, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. For years, people like her had been excluded from these rooms, their voices silenced before they could even be heard. Now all eyes were on her. The board chair, Catherine Reynolds, stood to address her. With sincerity that cut through the tension, Catherine acknowledged what the company had ignored for far too long. Monica wasn't just a cafeteria worker. She was the reason Langston Global still had a future. And for that, the board offered her the position of Director of Culinary Operations, with a salary more than 10 times what she had ever earned before. It was a remarkable victory, but Monica didn't accept without conditions. She demanded mandatory anti-discrimination training for all executives, a permanent employee committee to report abuses, and leadership opportunities for those historically excluded. Her terms were bold, even radical for a company that had thrived on silence. But the board, facing public outrage and desperate for redemption, agreed unanimously. Under Monica's leadership, Langston Global began a transformation no one thought possible. Training programs were launched to educate managers on bias and equity. Scholarships were created for young people from marginalized communities who dreamed of corporate careers. Former cafeteria workers and janitors found themselves promoted into supervisory roles for the first time in company history. Denise Carter, Monica's unexpected ally, was promoted to Chief Financial Officer, becoming the first Black woman in that role. Together, Monica and Denise reshaped the culture of Langston Global from one of fear and exploitation into one of accountability and respect. The results were undeniable. Within a year, employee productivity had surged, revenue hit record highs, and the company was featured on the cover of Business Vision magazine with the headline, "The Harris Revolution: How One Employee Saved a Corporate Giant." But Monica's impact went beyond corporate success. She became a national voice for dignity in the workplace. Universities invited her to lecture on leadership. Fortune 500 companies sought her advice on ethical reform. And one morning, she found herself standing in the East Room of the White House, honored as one of the decade's most transformative leaders. Her message was always the same. We don't have to accept disrespect to keep our jobs. We don't have to be silent to survive. We can build workplaces where dignity is the foundation. Her speeches spread across social media, striking a chord with millions who had faced their own battles against racism and exploitation. As for Edward Langston, his fall was complete. The man who once lived in an $18 million penthouse now rents a modest apartment in Cleveland. The vintage cars, the luxury vacations, the exclusive invitations, all gone. His ex-wife left him. His children changed their last name, and the wealthy friends who once flocked to his parties refused to take his calls. He spent his days working in retail, earning in a month what he once spent on a single dinner. It was the final irony. The man who had sneered at Monica for people like this now lived a life no different from those he once despised. And yet, Monica never measured her victory in his failure. Her true revenge wasn't seeing Edward destroyed. It was proving him wrong about her community, about what leadership really looks like. Because at its heart, this story isn't just about one arrogant man and one brave woman. It's about every workplace where silence is demanded, where racism hides behind polished walls, where dignity is traded for fear. It's about the countless people who endure humiliation just to survive, and the courage it takes to finally say, enough. So the question remains, how many more Monicas are out there, waiting for their moment to stand tall? And how many more Edwards are still protected by silence? The lesson is clear. Dignity is not negotiable. Respect cannot be bought. And sometimes it only takes one person willing to defy arrogance to remind the world that change is possible. Monica's courage shows us that even in the face of arrogance and racism, one voice can spark change that no one thought possible. Her stand against Edward Langston wasn't just about a job. It was about dignity, respect, and justice. If this story moved you, imagine how many others are still waiting to be told. By liking this video and subscribing to the channel, you're helping bring more of these powerful stories to light. Stay with us because voices like Monica's deserve to be heard.